On October 12, 1995, BAI interviewed a progressive Italian-American historian. I think her name was Jennifer Guglielmo. I didn't write it down then. She stated that it was promoted by the Mussolini backers, and that at that time the Italian working class was largely socialist and anarchist and had fought them in the streets. It was made at Holiday in 1937. Let's go back to 1492 when Spain was in the Reconquista. They made war to expel the Moors, as we all know. Isabella and Ferdinand, they wanted new riches, trade, colonies. The conquistadores sailed on their orders. They bankrolled them. Christopher Columbus was apparently no Italian. His name was Cristobal Colon. He was a Spanish pirate. If the Queen had known this, she'd have executed him. There's no evidence that he was ever in Genoa, the city he claimed. He read and wrote a lot, and of all his many papers he left, none of it's written in the tongue of Genoa. Okay, so he landed. He assessed the ready welcome of his friendly host, the Taino people, and he decided to attack, to kill, and take power. There are stories of him cutting off the arms of Taino men to feed to his war dogs. He wrote to the Queen immediately to convince her of the idea of making them slaves. Yes, Columbus invented the slave trade. He said, they would make good servants. They're fit to be ordered about and made to work. And with 50 men, we could subjugate them all and make them do whatever we want. Most of the slaves he sent back to Spain died quickly, and after a few years, Isabella and Ferdinand sent an investigator, Bobadilla, who arrived in Santo Domingo to find men jailed lined up to be hanged as rebels. He ordered Columbus arrested at that time, and Columbus' personal cook, Espinosa, put the chains on him. Once the first reports came back to Spain from Pizarro and from Cortez about the gold and silver in Peru and Mexico and the slavery, a steady stream of conquistadors moved out, all of them bankrolled by the monarchs. The conquistadors, Colon, Columbus, Cortez, Pizarro, Oñate, Coronado, de Soto, and many others. From their contemporary descriptions by those who knew them, we could characterize them maybe as a kind of a lumpen, sort of completely out of control mercenary force. They were motivated by arrogance, religious superiority, and greed. They used the requirement, the requerimento, I believe it's pronounced. It was a 3-paragraph announcement by the Spanish monarchy and the church in Rome to submit to these men, their representatives, or else knives and guns would next be used. And that was their excuse for murder, rape, torture, robbery on a level never before seen, enslavement of whole indigenous nations, and gold and silver mines, all in the name of the monarchs and the church. It's not possible for us to touch on all of them tonight, but I think it's important for all of us to know which ones are most hated still and which ones did the most damage. Isabella got wealth beyond all imagining. So did everyone who was with Francisco Pizarro, butcher of the Incas. Now, the Incas today, when we hear about them, they're either described as an empire or they're socialist and communist. We do know that they're the successors of an ancient farming communities which held land in common, and they were observed at that time distributing stores of supplies in the urban areas from warehouses to everyone in need, and they kept records of them. They gave supplies to the sick, elderly, poor, widows, and disabled. There's ruins at the city of Huanco who have 500 such warehouses that held over 1 million square feet of goods. The Incas were highly skilled in working gold and silver and platinum. They used a lot of bronze, but there was no iron available there. They were the world's finest weavers. They domesticated llamas and alpacas for pack, wool, meat. They were astute record keepers, but being weavers, they made all of their records with these intricate woven fringes of knotted string, and they had storehouses full of these archives of their records. They had advanced base 10 math with zeros and place notation. They had 14,000 paved roads running through the mountains, often stepped for the pack animals. Cusco at that time was 50 to 100,000 people, and there were a lot of smaller cities and towns. Pizarro, who is described by those who knew him as ruthless and devious, he tricked the Incas who had underestimated him based on reports that these were lazy robbers. He and his men attacked and killed 10,000 people at Atahualpa's court in an hour and a half. The court was unarmed because they had no fear of these men, and they fought to the last to defend themselves in Atahualpa, even as they cut their hands off and took him hostage. Atahualpa then offered the Spanish a personal ransom, a room full of gold and 2 of silver. For the next several months, llamas were carrying gold back from all over the Andes, from stripped temples and palaces. The outside walls of Cusco's main temple alone held 1.5 tons of gold plates. The entire ransom came to 7 tons of gold and 13 of silver, all of it in the form of artwork and jewelry and so forth. It has been estimated at $65 million based on the price of $400 an ounce, and I think that's out of date. No king in Europe had ever seen or even heard of anything like this sort of wealth. And you know, the conquistadors, they just melted it all down. Took them about a month at 1/4 ton a day. Pizarro then killed Atahualpa anyway and went on a rampage of plunder for more. In some buildings, they found 20-foot planks of silver. They took jewels off mummies. They killed so many people and the llamas that the public works, and including the irrigation canals, fell into decay, and the llamas were almost exterminated. Spain and Portugal had signed a treaty, by the way, in 1494 to divvy up colonies, and Portugal got the easternmost part of Brazil and Africa, and Spain took everything this side. Spain at that point was getting $30 million in gold every year shipped over. So much so that it became a target for the English, French, and Dutch pirates. Francis Drake alone captured $40 million in gold. Spain used that gold for a series of wars against France and the Turks, and then in the war against Protestantism. By the time their armada was sunk, they'd spent the treasury, but their programs of colonization and missionaries continued long after. The huge amounts of gold that went to Europe that were stolen didn't just fund wars and more conquest expeditions, they changed Europe. The bourgeoisie had its role in outfitting these wars and missions. Huge quantitative change led to qualitative change in the power of the bourgeoisie as they grew, and it directly led to the rise of capitalism. And colonialism just exploded in size in utter immense robberies of previously unknown rapaciousness. Getting back to the conquistadors, Coronado. He was known for wandering all over the Southwest in search of the 7 cities of gold and Quivira. He attacked, occupied, and burned several pueblos. And in fact, if any of you have been to the Southwest and visited some of the pueblos, what's left now is less than 1/3 of what there was at that time. They were all the way into the Texas Panhandle. In the 60s, when I was a kid, my dad took me to see the site of a collapsed kiva in the Panhandle. And if you're ever driving from Albuquerque up to Santa Fe and you go through Bernalillo, out west of Bernalillo, there's a park where you can go and see where there was 1 or 2 ruins there where Coronado personally burnt down the pueblos. Oñate, he was known for working thousands to death in the gold and silver mines in Zacatecas, and he left to take over New Mexico. He's hated to this day in New Mexico. He attacked Acoma Pueblo, which is known as like the 1,000-year city or whatever. I think some of you have been there. In 1599, when it rose up against the settlers, the Spanish killed 800 children, women, and men. Oñate then ordered every man over 25 to have a foot cut off and serve 25 years of slavery. Every female and male between the ages of 12 and 25 got 25 years of slavery. And 60 young girls were sent to priests in Mexico, never to return. To this day, they can't build a statue in New Mexico and all the way to El Paso without huge protests from the pueblos. And generally, eventually, those statues, there will be a foot sawed off, and no one ever knows who did it, you know? The one at the airport in El Paso, there was such protest against it that they just renamed Oñate the Equestrian. There were rebellions against Spain and the conquistadors. The biggest was in the Andes in Peru, led by Tupac Amaru II. There were records of the Incas melting gold down and pouring it down the throats of the conquistadors they captured. But the second biggest was in what's today New Mexico in 1680. Some say it was the Spanish fear of snakes and dolls that led them to burn 1,000-year-old Kachina dolls of the pueblos. Others say it was the beating of Popeye, who did lead the pueblos in the revolt, and they burnt burnt out the Spanish and kicked them out for 12 years. Pedro De Alvarado, another mass murderer, worked thousands to death in Guatemala in the mines. He hanged every local leader who tried to protect the people. He enslaved so many that the price of an Indian slave fell to 1/20th the price being paid in Mexico. Hernando de Soto was Pizarro's lieutenant, and he'd grown up, and he was proud of it, killing Indians in Panama in his teens, killing Indians in Nicaragua in his 20s. His part of Atahualpa's ransom made him a millionaire in gold, but he wanted Florida. So he went to Spain, and he got the grand bankroll, and he paid for an outfit of 600 soldiers, 200 horse, numbers of African and Mexican slaves, war dogs, and several hundred swine. And these were actually war pigs because they were trained to root out fields and flush ambushes. They left Florida north to either the Smokies or the Blue Ridge Mountains, then across the Mississippi all the way to Arkansas. And they followed the roads that were established in the paths from town to city, stealing food, burning storehouses, fields and towns and cities, kidnapping locals to enslave, and they burned them alive if they made trouble, cut their hands off if they didn't lead them to gold. They abducted the woman ruler of a city called Talomeco in a state called Cofitachiqui, and nobody today knows if that was Chalagi or Cherokee or Creek, and killed her for her pearl necklace. The DeSoto Party recorded events, as all of these expeditions did. They saw cities and towns newly abandoned due to smallpox already spreading all over from the Spanish landings. They were the first and last outsiders to ever see the living Mississippian culture, which is today called the Mound Builders. Smallpox and 7 other disease vectors that we now know lived in DeSoto's lost war pigs that went feral, spread disease everywhere through the whole Mississippi Basin and all the tributary rivers upstream. He attacked the original city of Mobile and abducted the leader, a woman. There was a huge battle and Mobile burnt down. Mobile, Alabama is named after that. The Mississippi culture, mounds that remain that you can see today were actually originally great earthen pyramids showing the influence of the Mayans and others. And the Mississippi culture depended completely on corn. They had miles and miles of crops of corn. Maize corn, by the way, was the first ever in human history selectively bred food grain in the world. And its scientific history is still being debated because it's so very different from the grass teosinte that people don't know today how the indigenous gardeners changed it from like a thumb-sized, nearly inedible seed pod to all the many varieties of maize corn that were being grown here by the time Columbus came. Maize corn was being raised up and down the East Coast, all over the Mississippi Valley, the Southwest, and more. And at the same time that agriculture was developing in Mesopotamia about 10,000 years ago, in Peru in the Chilca Canyon, the potato was being domesticated and cropped. The word used in Spanish for potatoes, papas, is the original Incan word. By 1491, they had thousands of varieties in existence, one for every elevation going from the Andean peaks down to the valleys. The Incans preserved great masses of the potato papas crops by mashing them and freeze-drying them, and they'd last 10 years as a food store in case of the drought. And they did all of that with wooden tools. The stories that Native people took these unwashed armed men for gods is disproven over and over again by contradictory anecdotes. Incas thoroughly investigated these strange men, but they made the mistake of underestimating them in their disgust for their personal behavior and their filth. In 1502, Columbus accidentally encountered a large seagoing canoe the length of a galley off Honduras, and it was a Mayan crew. They ordered the Spaniards to get out of their way. It took the conquistadors till 1511 to figure out that the Mayans were 120 miles west of them. They were crushed at the first battle against them at, I'm not sure how to pronounce the name of the town, Champoton, 1517, but by 1519, the Spanish had begun to enslave Africans and bring them to Cuba, where subsequent excursions into the hemisphere now deployed also African slaves. There's a link in all of this with the fight against the racist use of the word savage in the anti-Muslim posters on the MTA. That and the word primitive have been used endlessly with that question for 520 years against all the indigenous peoples of the world. Columbus was savage. Capitalism, savage. Imperialism is savage, right? And we can use other words in place of primitive in our economic and political discussion. Pre-class society, early accumulation of capital, original communism when we discuss humanity. Imagine the continual effect on the consciousness of just the use of these two words only over the last 200 years. People see it in literature and they accept it. People of color see it and resent it. Our youth are affected negatively, and so are our social relations with people outside our communities. The true fact is the term hunter-gatherer is generally also wrongly used. Perhaps it's accurate for the period when people around the world were first surviving the ice ages, but it's another way of saying primitive. All of humanity is adaptable and creative in learning to use the resources available and in their environments. These societies were gardening more than gathering. At some time after the last ice age in Asia and later in Europe, they domesticated livestock animals. Over here in 1491, what was actually going on across Great Turtle Island, North America, and the land of the condor, South America, was a whole hell of a lot of gardening, growing of crops, even in the forests. Over 1/2 of all of the food crops in the world today, by numbers of species and by volume and weight, sold are indigenous to this hemisphere, and were all domesticated by indigenous people, from popcorn to pumpkins. Tomatoes, squash, all kinds of beans, maize corn, various berries and nuts, potatoes, chocolate, pineapples, cassava, the manioc, various palm oils, avocados, papaya, quinoa, amaranth, acai, and too many others to name, really. And all the chilies that the Spanish took all over the world that Columbus mistakenly named peppers. What's primitive about the cultivation of so many diverse food crops? What's primitive about Mayan and Incan development of the concept of the zero, of the astronomical sciences of all the ancient peoples of this world? Between 3200 and 2500 BCE, before the current era, large-scale public buildings were erected in at least 7 places on the Peruvian coast. The only other urban center that we know of today at that time was Sumer on the Tigris-Euphrates. And then there's the fact that across this continent, people from small villages to cities lived communally. There were 500 nations, and most of them were still matrilineally structured. I mean, here within the U.S. alone. There's nothing primitive about a society which is so equal and free, yet completely functional on the basis of no classes at all. And by the way, comrades and friends, Native women today typically use the word matrilineal because it doesn't imply a hierarchy. There are so many different and complex traditions of music, art, storytelling, dance, theater in our histories and still surviving. And about the agriculture, in Amazonia today, in the forest, people can walk through and pick fruit to eat. Scientists tell us these are all old orchards. There were 138 crops just alone being grown in Amazonia, half of which were trees. Also, there were huge tracts of artificially built up soil. The Amazon has really bad acidic red soil, and by some today still unknown process, the people who live there in several different nations or communities created two types of very dark, nutritious soil, terra preta, for their crops, and they used charcoal, broken pottery, and probably animal and fish remains, and it provided all the needed nutrients for plants like phosphorus, calcium, sulfur, organic matter. The Amazon was being terraformed before 1492. Conservative estimates put that extent at a few thousand square miles, or 0.1 to 0.3% of the basin. That's about the size of the cropped land that the Mayans had. Others estimate up to 10%, which would be the size of France. In original communism or communalism, the form of the family was healthy and vibrant, and we call it the extended family. It provides all the support needed for the individual, for the children. Everyone knows they belong. People who are not related are adopted in as well. And there's no isolation of the self. There's no alienation from society like we see today to the detriment of our youth. By contrast, the nuclear family under bourgeois society is like a little piece of it got amputated and lacks support. The clash of cultures that began with the invasion of the conquistadors and continued with the invasions of the English and French and the Russians on the West Coast still had positive effects on the settlers, some of which enabled them to survive here, like the adoption of the food crops and various articles of clothing and other technology. The gender equality of the women was not understood or accepted by the Europeans, but they had been living under feudalism for hundreds of years. The National Women's History Project in the U.S. states many early women's rights leaders were inspired by what they call the Seneca's matriarchal society. And Ben Franklin has famously noted the impact of the Iroquois Great Law of Peace on the Constitution. And bathing was a daily practice. The British and French are often noted in records as being amazed at this because most of them had never had a bath in their lives. And the ideas that have been adopted from the fashions are too numerous to even go into. That'd be a whole nother talk. But getting back to the smallpox, up until 1492, there was very little contact between these two hemispheres. No one here had any immunity to the diseases that were brought over by the invaders, precisely because these were diseases that jumped species from domesticated animals of Asia and Europe were rats. Half the Aztecs, half the Incas, and the Mayans died before the fighting in which they were overthrown. It was more severe than the Black Death, and it killed leaders, advisors, generals, and elders. Cortez lost the first assault on the Aztec capital, Tenochtitlan. Then smallpox hit for 60 days, leaving everyone too sick to even move. And those who survived when it began to diminish faced Cortez because he had come back by then. Disease traveled out from everywhere the Spanish and later invading forces had landed, and it traveled to every corner of the hemisphere. Okay, in 1491, it's been estimated that there were some 112 million people living in this hemisphere. The Mexican plateau alone, we know, had 25.2 million based on colonial records. And these diseases, smallpox, flu, measles, etc., killed 80 to 100 million people in 100 to 150 years. It works out to about 20% of the world's population at that time, as the UN figures that the world had 500 million people in 1600. Now, the work that was done by progressive scientists in the 50s and 60s to achieve this more realistic figure is still under attack by racists in their fields. By the time the English and the French arrived, the waves of smallpox epidemics had even left numerous villages of the dead, which the settlers found on the seaboard and across the land. Sometimes they just moved right in like the Pilgrims. Decimated indigenous nations now faced waves of settlers, anxious and mean with greed to steal the land and create wealth, and a totally alien perspective of the settlers and their view of the land, the environment, as something to be used and abused to make money as opposed to being stewarded and cared for to encourage the wealth of food and other resources that had been available. The indigenous nations fought back, but the fighting came long after the waves of death had shifted the balance of forces to the invaders. In 1776, we know most of the fighting wasn't against the British, it was against the Cherokee. The Americans burned 100 Tsalagi villages to the ground and all of their crops to steal huge tracts of land from Virginia going south, and that whole nation was refugeed to the mountains with the shirts on their backs in the middle of the winter. And comrades and friends, did you know that today in Canada, they're honoring Tecumseh, the Shawnee leader, and a white general with tribute to saving Canada from U.S. takeover in 1812. And as all of us know, Marx and Engels were very excited to read the work of Lewis Henry Morgan, who was the first to write of the matrilineal societies in the extended family based on the Haudenosaunee. But most don't know that he met Tonawanda Seneca Eli Parker, I'm not sure how he pronounced his name, when they were both working as clerks in a bookshop upstate. He learned everything he knew from Parker, who was later General Ulysses Grant's right-hand man, the military secretary, who took the surrender at Appomattox. Going into the 19th century, the U.S. declared manifest destiny to take the West. We had the Trail of Tears, the California Gold Rush, the Plains Wars, and all of these wars and atrocities led up to the U.S. Becoming imperialist when it finally took on Spain itself in 1898. In 1891, Congress passed the Dawes Act to break up the communally owned lands of the reservations and mandated individual ownership, but in plots small enough to leave a lot of land left over for the Sooners in Oklahoma, plots too small to be viable as well. Ironically, only the Pueblos were protected from the Dawes Act because they were under the legal status of the Spanish land grants. The 1898 Curtis Act dissolved tribal governments and the courts. There are many undocumented people in Oklahoma, including full-bloods today, who aren't able to be members because their ancestors refused to get on the rolls at a certain time and they didn't get their allotments. In Oklahoma, in World War I, when Eugene Debs was in jail under the Palmer raids, the biggest rebellion against the fratricidal war this side of the Atlantic took place, the Green Corn Rebellion, named after the Cherokee New Year. Indigenous, black and white farmers and workers came together to fight back, and they were suppressed by the National Guard. Today, capitalist society portrays all indigenous people as either completely wiped out and free to use for a Halloween costume, or only recognized if they fit a particular stereotype from Hollywood or whatever. There are so many local struggles that we never really even hear about. This is still Indian land, and the struggle continues. This is the significance of Day of Mourning. If you've never gone to Day of Mourning, I'd like to strongly urge you to get on the bus and come this year. You're going to hear from Leonard Peltier, who sends his support every year from prison in Florida this year. You'll hear about struggles across Great Turtle Island and how indigenous people view the current U.S. wars. And we salute Osceola, the leader of the Seminole Nation, the Southern Creeks who had adopted the runaway slaves in Florida who never surrendered to the U.S. We look to the Green Corn Rebellion for our inspiration in this struggle, and we salute the United American Indians of New England, whose slogan is, "We're not vanishing, we are not conquered, we are as strong as ever." And if you bear with me one more minute, I'd like to make an announcement because we also are kicking off Building for Day of Mourning tonight. It's a